I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, debt. From boom to bust, what drives our economy? Is it tangible stuff or actually a global addiction to credit, debt, central banks printing money and low interest rates? We confront the difficult truth that financial lessons invariably aren't learnt. Also this week, the Internet of Things, technology that's not just part of our lives but literally controls it. A former hacker tells us how vulnerable this all is, and an insurance expert tells us how to protect against it. And a two-time world boxing champion who became arguably one of the best salesmen in the world tells us about making money in and out of the ring. So we're taking a step back this week on Counting the Cost to take in the big picture, the quote-unquote global economy, and whether it's really learnt its lesson from what was the worst financial crisis in a generation. Because the evidence suggests the world is still hooked on credit, and debt for that matter, and that it's a global issue, not just a first world problem, as they say. Now, it's widely believed the financial crisis started with Lehman Brothers, and that may be true, but by the third quarter of 2008, lending to households had already risen to $12.7 trillion, and consumers were already failing to make their mortgage payments. Then there were 3 rounds of quantitative easing, which saved the financial sector for sure, but expanded the Fed's balance sheet to $4.5 trillion. Now, US debt is almost that much, $18 trillion, which is slightly higher than the size of the whole economy. But here's a thought. We've been here before. The Asian financial crisis in the late 90s was triggered by a build-up of credit, and it needed what was, at the time, the biggest bailouts in history. At the heart of the problem were the banks and the corporations borrowing money from overseas institutions, and yet foreign bank loans in 2006 grew from $210 billion to $260 billion. And remember Japan's asset bubble that popped in the 1990s? That was fueled by cheap money too, with consumers and corporations taking on huge levels of debt. Japan's consumer debt rose 9-fold to 67 trillion yen in 1991. And Japanese industrial companies raised $638 billion through the stock market, driving the biggest spending spree since 1945. I know it's a lot of big numbers and the like, but we have to talk about this. Otherwise, our friend, the quote-unquote global economy, is pretty much doomed to repeat its mistakes. So I'd like to introduce you to our feature guest this week, Philip Lane, who is the Whately Professor of Political Economy at Trinity College in Dublin. He's also one of the authors of a report called Deleveraging, What Deleveraging, which looks at, among other things, the efforts to reduce debt post-crisis. Philip, welcome to Counting the Cost. I want to start with this idea that recessions we described all seem to have the same starting point, that people, banks take on too much debt. Is that a succinct way of describing the situation?
So it is an enduring problem in the world economy that with the world characterised by very low interest rates, there is a strong temptation to take on debt. So before '07, this was really played out in US and Europe. But since really after the global crisis, since '09-10, in fact, the big story has been borrowers in emerging markets, especially in China, by the way, taking on debt. By the way, it's not banks are not necessarily the main source of debt these days. A lot of the debt accumulating now is our corporates issuing bonds. So, the next wave of debt, if you like, is not necessarily going to be a banking story. It could be a story about default on bonds, which have similar but slightly different characteristics.
Similar but slightly different, but I mean, is that potentially worse when you get into bond problems? Is that getting
no, to be
more dangerous?
No, I wouldn't say that because the special feature of banks is banks are supposed to provide safe returns to depositors. So governments always care more about banks because so many households, so many individuals have trusted their savings to banks. Whereas people who invest in the bond market, if you like, are better able to take those risks. So, of course, if there's unexpected defaults, there's still going to be problems, but probably there'd be less by way of bailouts, if you like, from the governments involved.
OK, so you mentioned bailouts there. That's good. Another post-crisis feature was this quantitative easing, which went through 3 rounds in the United States. Yes or no? Was it a good idea? Was it the only real idea at the time? Was it the only thing that would have actually worked?
Absolutely. So I know it sounds paradoxical to say the solution to high debt is to encourage, if you like, more debt by having this purchaser, the central banks, being a big purchaser of these securities. But that really, it's not really to critique quantitative easing. It's just a symptom, a reflection of the underlying problem, which is when you have a world economy where it looks like there's a large amount of available savings and for whatever reason, not enough productive investment, then you get these strange patterns. But the problem, of course, is if the world turns, if the interest rates go up over time, those who took on debt when it was cheap may come to regret it. And that is the big policy concern, is that, it's very hard to say when interest rates are so low, do not borrow. But many people have lived to regret taking on debt. So the message, for policymakers and for individuals is, do your own stress test. Can you live with the amount of debt you're currently taking on? Let's say if interest rates were 4 or 6% instead of the current low rate. So that is really the issue, is if the world turns, what looks like a good deal now could be a very regrettable mistake.
This is just the thing, Philip. I think it requires some personal responsibility in the end, and that's even going down as far as the everyday person in the street who uses their credit card, who needs to be able to stay within their means. And the thing that concerns me the most is that banks and corporations don't do that. They get overexcited during the good times and don't think about what could go wrong.
Right. So the big, I think, move since the crisis is, I think until '08, the prevailing wisdom was, you have to trust individuals. If they take on these risks, it must be because they've made the calculation and it's kind of an informed risk. Now the view would be there has to be more intervention. The natural, bias of individuals is maybe be too optimistic and not sufficiently take into account downside risk. So in the world of central banking, this is now phrased as macroprudential policymaking. So it's kind of instructing banks not to lend above a certain value on a house. It's instructing banks to say you can only lend to an individual to some low multiple of his or her income. And it's also instructing banks to make sure they have enough loss-absorbing capital. So in other words, to minimize the risk that the taxpayer has to step in. So it does mean there has to be more intervention by central banks by governments for that matter, because really individuals cannot be expected to kind of factor in all of the risk factors that are out there. It's up to policymakers to, if you like, take a paternalistic role in managing this risk.
But are we also looking at, and I think this might be related to what we've just talked about, greater levels of inequality since all this spending's gone on? That we've actually fueled something that either wasn't thought about at the time or the consequences weren't thought about at the time.
Well, what's interesting about that is I think there are kind of conflicting directions there. So you might think, well, if quantitative easing is leading to increases in stock market values and so on, that might increase inequality. And it is true that's going to initially benefit those who own a lot of stocks and shares. On the other hand, quantitative easing means that the recessions are being minimized. It boosts the real economy, and by keeping people in jobs, that also moves in the opposite direction. And low interest rates, remember, low interest rates are a benefit to debtors and they're a cost to savers. And in most societies, the savers are really the higher income people. The debtors tend to be middle and lower income people. So the low interest rates obtained by quantitative easing, in fact, reduce inequality. So it's important to kind of add up across those different mechanisms. And the studies I've seen, in fact, more actually would say that the quantitative easing reduces inequality. It's not boosting inequality. Because of the fact the super rich really benefit from high interest rates because they have so much money on deposit. And that mechanism, is worked against by quantitative easing.
Philip Lane, I called this a conversation we needed to have, and I thank you for having it with us on Counting the Cost. Thank you so much for your time. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, a knockout in and out of the ring. George Foreman gives his take on business and boxing a little later in the programme. We want to look at cyber technology now and the idea of your online safety. See, we're using tablets and smartphones to control a lot of our lives. In fact, there's a good chance you're watching this on such a device. But a former member of the notorious hacking group Anonymous has told us people don't seem to realise just how vulnerable they are when buying and using internet-connected devices. Phil Lavelle has more from the World Web Summit in Dublin.
There's making coffee the old way.
And that control panel actually controls the coffee pot.
And the new way.
It's pretty neat.
The simple act of brushing your teeth, there's an app for that. Even cars drive themselves these days. They're already being tried out on some roads. Welcome to the Internet of Things, a new world where more than just computers and phones are connected, and it is here to stay.
The Internet of Things is a massive deal here this year for the startups, for the developers. They are all hugely excited. We're told this is the technology which will revolutionise every aspect of our lives. But it is new technology, remember, and with all new technology, there does come a bit of a health warning. There may be trouble ahead.
Because the hackers are watching. This one told me lots of manufacturers are so concerned with being first to market, they're not making their devices secure enough. And he knows a thing or two about that. As part of the Anonymous group, he helped cause havoc on the internet a few years back. Indicted twice in the US, charged at home in Ireland, and he's only 21 years old.
It really is just a case of people are trying to get these hardware devices out the door as quick as possible without really having security in mind. And once these devices are shipped, they're very seldom updated. You buy a box for €50, €100, plug it in, you never think that it needs to be updated.
These specialists showed me how they managed to hack into a computer printer and made it play a game.
I'm able to control the bulbs. Cool, huh?
And there's a dark side to some internet-connected light bulbs. You control them using a phone or a tablet and give your home a nice glow. You may also, unintentionally, give a hacker private information. They found it easy enough.
The target is not the light bulb. The light bulb is sort of a means to an end. It allows you to get into the sensitive areas of people's networks. So you could just sit outside someone's house and access their internal network.
But the industry is in a spin and says it is all just a learning process.
A lot of the systems that are out there today are at very basic. You know, we're like 1977 in the computer revolution right now. Obviously, things are going to mature, as they always do, right? And security will get greater and greater.
The Internet of Things is set to change our lives. The hackers are on course for it. Question is, are the rest of us?
So there's absolutely no doubt that cybercrime and hacking is now a huge issue, which made it very interesting to see that it's only just really getting onto the radar screens of businesses when they talk about risks. Have a look at this survey from the insurance giant Allianz. It is their top 10 global business risks for 2014. Predictably, you've got things like business and supply interruption, natural catastrophes, fire near the top of the list. Loss of reputation or brand comes in at number 6. But cybercrime is only at number 8, and it's the first time it's even made it into that top 10. And further to that, the global insurance broker Willis Group sees an emerging threat to the Middle East as more business comes to this part of the world. I spoke to Willis Group's executive director Richard Ryan about the increased cyber risk and how you actually insure against it.
Yeah, really there should be no surprise at all, and the fact that it's come in this year, you would have thought only number 8. In fact, why isn't it higher? And I think part of the problem has been educating board level members, so the board of directors, in exactly what the extent of cyber risk actually means to their business, and also C-suite level executives. So I think some of it is about the message is finally getting across, especially as we're seeing more data breaches and cyber threats growing in the marketplace. So I think that accounts for being number 8, but I think you can expect it to certainly go further up the top 10 ladder.
So why the specific problem with the Middle East? Is it that there is a sophistication problem? It's still a developing area, so systems can't cope with this sort of thing? Is there more risk here?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's more at risk, but certainly there are lucrative targets here, especially in oil and gas, defence, financial institutions and banking, healthcare and retail. Some of it is about sophistication. If you look at the energy market review that Willis conducted and we conducted annually, we certainly look at technology in industrial control systems and how they have become internet facing. And as organisations grow and develop, what you find and discover is there are old technologies mixing with new ones, which leaves gaps for cyber criminals to exploit. So as these companies or organisations develop and cross other boundaries, through mergers and acquisitions, some recent research discovered that one organisation, through an aggressive program of mergers and acquisitions, had accumulated different IT platforms. The cyber criminals were in there a couple of months before they'd actually been discovered.
So this brings us to the point of why we're talking to you, and that's how do you insure against this sort of thing? Now, it is as big a risk as a fire or a natural disaster or anything like that, and yet because it's new, a new type of risk, I wonder, are we sort of feeling our way here and almost making up the rules as we go along?
I think there is a degree of that, because people are still trying to understand exactly what the risk is. What is that risk to my business? If I suffer a data breach or a cyber attack, what am I actually going to face? What are the problems I'm going to face? But more importantly, you have to know what the effects of those risks are going to be to that business. And it can happen to a small company or a large company. They all spend significant amounts of time and money in growing their brand, their reputation, their image. Within a couple of weeks, that can cause, significant harm can be caused to those things.
Well, you say in a couple of weeks. I would suggest it could even happen quicker. This is what I was leading on to. You have a cyber attack which happens out of nowhere, like that, like a natural disaster would. But then how do you quantify the damage? How do you know the damage is done? See, if there was a fire, for example, you'd know, okay, I've lost X amount of thousands worth of stock or whatever it is, and you can offset things against it. With a cyber attack, it could be ongoing, and how do you really know what's been lost, and how do you insure against that?
There certainly is an unquantifiable element, and I think that's going to change in the future, especially with regulation. I mean, in the US, it's fairly well established because of the notification protocols that they have. They're able to assess the effect on a consumer, a data breach, what that means. Look at the amount of personal identifiable information that organisation has, and then put a fixed cost to it. I think in the EU, especially of concern to the GCC, should be the new data privacy regulations that are coming into force in the next 12 to 18 months' time, which will make it much more quantifiable, because the EU is taking a fairly aggressive stance on data protection and privacy.
Do you feel, from what you're seeing with your business, from the business you see coming through, that people are taking it more seriously, that it is going to hit up the list and people realise we actually need to think about this a lot sooner than we might usually?
Yes, we are seeing that to a degree. It's by no means near where it should be in terms. There's still a big gap at board level, thinking that it's still the preserve of the IT department within their organisation. It really has grown beyond that. And when you look at the way organisations are interfacing with the internet, with their acquisition programs, working in different jurisdictions, the risk goes well beyond the IT department nowadays.
Finally this week, the one and only time we can legitimately talk about boxing, business and grilled foods in the one story. Hopefully that is enough of a clue, but for those of you not aware of either the Rumble in the Jungle or the Lean, Mean, Fat-Reducing Grilling Machine, they are both the product of boxing legend George Foreman, two-time world champion, estimated to be worth $250 million, and a recent visitor to Doha. So sports reporter Richard Parr sat down with him to talk sport and business.
Former two-time heavyweight champion of the world, Big George Foreman. Take the boxing.
Hi George, welcome to Doha. I want to start at the beginning. You joined the Jobs Corporation, which helped you find boxing. What did that teach you about work ethic?
What I learned leaving home at about 16 and joining the Job Corps, it didn't take me long to learn that if you're going to get something, you're going to have to work for it. And I found that to be a fact, even in sports. The bell ring, but nothing's going to come to you. You got to work for it.
When you began boxing, you had an incredible record. I think it was 40 wins without loss, 37 knockouts. What stops you from being complacent?
And the one thing important about boxing, you must stay motivated. You got to look at yourself as just starting off. This is actually the first time I've gotten into the ring, and you think like that every time, you nothing but win. Although, when I fought Muhammad Ali, I kind of put that on ice. I figured I'd already made it. So I lacked a little motivation properly anyway, that fight, and I lost.
It was 40 years ago last week since the rumble in the jungle against Muhammad Ali. What do you remember about the fight, and Kinshasa in particular?
Can you believe in the day, it was called Zaire 40 years ago. I'm in the ring with Muhammad Ali. I thought it would be the most easy fight I'd had. But as the rounds 4, 5, 6 started coming on, I knew something different was going to happen. And I'll never forget that about the 6th round, 7th round. I realized I'm in for the fight of my life. You don't forget moments like that.
You obviously faced Muhammad Ali and worked with promoters such as Don King. What did you learn from them about selling and promotion and marketing that you would later use as a businessman?
I'd gone through boxing, all I cared about was the payday and the knockout. I did. But then having 10 years out of boxing, I looked back at Don King, Muhammad Ali, and all these characters. I realized that if I was going to be successful further in life, I was going to have to learn to sell. And that's something I pride myself on right now, not being an ex-boxer, not being anything other than a salesperson. That's what I am.
During that 10-year gap between the first retirement and your second run in boxing, what did you learn about yourself and what you'd later use as a businessman?
I had to get a chance to meet George Foreman. I remember I was preaching on the street corner. I'd shaved my beloved mustache. I'd cut all the hair off my head, and I was about 300 pounds. No one knew me. I had to get out there and sell. Hey, I'm George Foreman. Yes, I fought Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, and I made them stop. And I learned that if you can make people stop and look for a second, you may be able to get them to buy. And that was what I consider the recreation of George Foreman, learning to stop them and sell.
After your second run in boxing, you became the face of grills, George Foreman Grill. Why did you choose grills?
I'd already been a hit on Madison Avenue, selling everything from McDonald's to Meineke Car Care. And so one friend said, George, you're making all these products and these people wealthy. Why don't you get your own product and make yourself wealthy? And then we pursued this grill. It was not the beautiful piece of furniture that it is now. I put my name on there, started to go foot, pacing all over the country, selling the grill. And it just went right along because I told everybody that I was training with hamburgers anyway. So the grill would slope the grease away from your food and make it moist, and at the same time take the fat out. I sold that idea. I'm still happy about that. The grill, a perfect match for George Foreman.
And after the success of the grill, how would that help you decide your future business ventures you'd go into?
Number one, they must be good. And two, I gotta believe in it. And I've been doing that since. The grill just motivated me to look for more products.
Do you have any favorites?
Well, I have a cleaning product. It's really, it's hard to get people to think about doing something environmentally friendly. And that's what I got, a cleaning product. It may be the best thing that I've ever done. It's not as hot as the grill, but you go to bed at night thinking, I'm doing something for the planet.
And what's next for George Foreman?
I like the idea of thinking, what's next? I wake up every morning thinking, what's next? And I'm looking for things to motivate me, but I know there is a next. That's the most important thing. Forget about the past. What am I gonna do in the future? I'm jumping out of the bed every morning thinking of what's next.
Great stuff there. That is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/programs. The Counting the Cost page is there with individual reports and links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Down the side as well, there's Richard and George Foreman. Actually, that's the social media feed. If you want to send your comments and feedback, you can do that by tweeting me at Kamal AJE. Or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag Counting the Cost when you tweet as well, won't you? Or just send us an email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.